Hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. It's Friday the 12th of November and this is Scotland at 7. I'm Andrew Wilson and this evening I'm hosting the programme from Edinburgh. First we will have today's coronavirus update, then we will look at today's news headlines from Scotland and around the world, and then we will have two longer items which we've prepared this week during COP26 in Glasgow. As of 2 p.m. today, since the start of the pandemic, a total of 3,513,124 people in Scotland have been tested through the NHS Scotland labs and the UK Government regional testing centres. Of these, 2,835,716 have been confirmed negative, and 677,408 have tested positive. There are 3,349 new cases of COVID-19 confirmed by a test, although remember not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all of those with symptoms will be tested. Of the people who have tested positive, 759 were in hospital last night, 55 of whom were in intensive care. And I'm afraid to say that there are 17 new reported deaths of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection in total now stands at 9,375. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. The latest UK daily figures show that 142,678 patients who tested positive for COVID-19 have sadly died from their illness, and that is an increase of 145 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. And as of 8 a.m. this morning, 4,325,523 people had received their first dose of the COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,922,893 had received their second dose. Now, just before we came on air this evening, we watched the full-time score from the Moldova against Scotland game being played at the Zimbru Stadium in Chisinau. Goals from Nathan Patterson and Che Adams, along with a penalty saved by Craig Gordon, have secured the 3 points and second place in the group. The 2-0 win means that our Scotland team has a playoff spot for the next World Cup. According to a report in The Guardian, the luxury villa where Boris Johnson stayed on holiday last month is linked to Costa del Sol property businesses owned by Zac Goldsmith's family that have been engaged in a multi-million-pound tax evasion scheme, according to the Spanish courts. Court papers obtained by The Guardian show that tax inspectors ordered two property companies owned by the Goldsmith family to pay €24 million in unpaid taxes and fines after investigating what they said was a suspicious property deal. The tax authorities' findings have been upheld by one of Spain's highest courts, with judges agreeing that the companies effectively engaged in a deliberate effort to evade tax and committed serious violations of the law. Documents indicate Spanish authorities are seeking to recover the funds and could even seize parts of the family's land, which is spread across more than 600 hectares of private woodland, about 10 miles from the Marbella coastline. This revelation raises difficult questions for the Prime Minister, who has already faced criticism for refusing to declare his use of the luxury property in the MP's Register of Interests, which would require him to disclose the monetary value of this gift from the Goldsmith family. The draft COP26 declaration published this morning has come in for criticism for being insufficient to achieve the target to limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Discussions have continued all day and have passed the 6 p.m. deadline without agreement. Alok Sharma, the president of the meeting, has suggested that the deadline would be missed earlier this afternoon, but he said he still hoped to produce a revised text today that can then be agreed and adopted later tonight. He said that there would be another round of stock-taking later tonight, with the exact time to be confirmed in due course. Climate talks are notorious for overrunning. The talks may continue into tomorrow or even to Sunday. but there will be another round of stock taking later tonight, and the exact timing of that will be confirmed later on. Meanwhile, at lunchtime today, COP26 civil society delegates staged a walkout from the conference in protest at the perceived failure of governments to reach agreement which would achieve the target of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees Celsius. Speakers at the People's Plenary in the conference Blue Zone condemned the legitimacy and ambition of the COP26 summit. Speakers and audience then walked out of the conference centre chanting "Climate Justice Now" to join protesters gathered on the streets outside the Blue Zone. A new climate change-focused fellowship promoting equal participation by women in the peace resolution is being supported as part of the £300,000 funding commitment from the Scottish Government. The Beyond Borders UNSCR 1325 Climate Change Fellowship will provide peacekeeping, negotiation and reconstruction training to women in areas of conflict. This will enable climate activists, people from Indigenous and island communities, and areas where there is no state control to share their experience of issues of gender, climate change and conflict. This new programme is one of 3 fellowships delivered by Beyond Borders to support women with conflict resolution and supported by the Scottish Government funding in 2021-22. The Fellowship on Conflict Resolution has involved over 250 women from more than 20 countries across the Middle East, North Africa and South Asia since it began work in 2016. The Beyond Borders founder, Mark Muller-Stewart QC, said, "Beyond Borders welcomes the continued support of the Scottish Government for the development of the Women in Conflict 1325 Peacemaking Fellowship Programme. Since 2016, the Fellowship has created a unique community of practice of women working on conflict resolution and peace building, and will now build upon this community in exploring the critical nexus of climate change, gender, conflict, and security." Meanwhile, changes to the way that slurry and digestate are stored and spread on farms could lead to a reduction of up to 70% of the harmful ammonia that is released. Amendments have been made to the Water Environment Controlled Activities Scotland Regulations 2011. These include improving controls on the storage of slurry and digestate to reduce leakage, and more targeted spreading to maximise the nutrient benefit and to reduce emissions. Agriculture is the largest contributor to ammonia emissions, and a key element of the regulations is the phasing out of broadcast spreading of slurries by splash plates and the introduction of low-emission precision spreading equipment. These changes are being made following a 12-week public consultation and engagement with the agricultural sector and the National Farmers Union Scotland. The changes will be phased in, with some farms having up to 5 years to comply. The Minister for Environment and Land Reform, Barry McLenachan, said, "While slurry and digestate are important nutrients for use on our farms, they can also be damaging to our natural environment if not used properly, causing harmful emissions into our air and water. Agriculture accounts for around 90% of ammonia emissions, so by using low-emission precision equipment, we can reduce the ammonia emissions by up to 70%, protecting our vital water environment and reducing the agricultural impact on climate change." The Scottish Government is to help fund a new national network of community sharing libraries and repair cafes as part of a drive to reduce consumption and cut waste. Under the £310,000 reuse and repair scheme, funded jointly with Zero Waste Scotland, more resource libraries will be established across Scotland, a key recommendation of Scotland's Climate Assembly. The facilities allow people to borrow items such as high-quality tools, equipment, clothes and toys, rather than buying them. The scheme, which is overseen by the Circular Community Scotland charity in collaboration with Edinburgh Tool Library and Edinburgh Remakery, will also see more repair cafes set up to teach people the skills to repair items. A report by Social Investment Scotland on behalf of Zero Waste Scotland in 2020 identified 24 repair cafes and sharing library projects in Scotland, and the intention is to increase this to 100 over the next 3 years. The Cabinet Secretary for Net Zero, Michael Matheson, said, "Scotland's Climate Assembly called for action, and I'm very pleased that we will support a network of resource libraries and repair cafes." In Europe, Turkey has blocked citizens of Syria, Yemen and Iraq from buying flight tickets to Belarus as the EU puts pressure on foreign governments over their role in the arrival of thousands of people from the Middle East at its eastern border. Belavia, the Belarusian state airline, said it would no longer carry citizens of those countries to Belarus days before a planned announcement of new sanctions from the EU that could target airlines. Turkish Airlines, which is 49% state-owned, has also pledged to limit migrant flights to Belarus, EU officials said today. The EU has accused Belarus of encouraging people fleeing war-torn parts of the world to fly to Minsk and then facilitating their travel to the border with Poland. Hundreds of people are now living in a tent camp on the Belarus-Poland border in near-freezing temperatures. Poland, which has established a state of emergency in the border region, enforced by hundreds of troops, has refused to allow them in. The Polish Defence Minister said today that the UK Royal Engineers had deployed with Polish troops at the border to reconnoitre and plan reinforcements to fencing meant to keep migrants out of the EU. The flight's decision by Turkey's Aviation Directorate should in effect close Istanbul as a major transit hub for people who want to reach the EU via Belarus from Iraq, Syria and elsewhere in the Middle East. Turkish Airlines and Belavia have denied any role in trafficking people to Belarus. Belavia had previously said it could not deny a ticket holder the right to fly if their documents were in order. Iraqi Airlines has also said it will not resume flights to Minsk, the EU Commission announced. Alexander Lukashenko's decision to spark a crisis on the Polish border is seen as an act of revenge for the EU's criticism of his brutal crackdown on the opposition, and also an attempt to move the conversation on domestically from last year's pro-democracy protests. Lukashenko is also threatening to block supplies of natural gas from a pipeline linking Russia to Europe in retaliation for sanctions. And so this evening we have two video items for you. Firstly, we have an interview with Lorna Slater that was filmed at the Green Hub in Glasgow this morning. And then we have an interview with Tom McLenachan of Aqua that was filmed this afternoon.
This is Lorna Slater, a Green member of the Scottish Government, here at the final day of COP26 in Glasgow. Good morning, Lorna. What do you think is your general assessment of the way it's moving, particularly as the second draft of the agreement was published this morning?
Well, I think the second draft of the agreement is actually quite concerning. It seems to have been watered down from the first draft. And the first draft, the Climate Action Tracker had assessed that the first draft would only keep global heating to 2.4 degrees. 2.4 degrees is very dangerous, and it's a lot higher than the 1.5 degrees that we're all here to try and make happen. So this watered down draft is even worse. And I think that this is putting island nations and nations in the global south at risk of ruination. And it's been watered down by the rich countries in the north, in the global north, and by fossil fuel interests. So I'm very concerned about the draft. We've cancelled our event this morning. We were to have an event with green ministers from around the world, but we've cancelled it because those green ministers are in the negotiating rooms right now trying to save this deal.
So what we've heard overnight is that the oil-producing nations in particular, who have more delegates than anyone else at the conference, I've heard talk of them going around meetings and watering down the language, changing things like urge to request and just generally softening the language. Is that what you hear?
Yes, I think that's exactly what's happened, is the oil-producing nations and the nations in the global north have gone around looking at what they think is in their interest and ignoring the interest of people in the global south and the island nations. This is a callous disregard for human suffering and for the economies of those countries who didn't contribute to the climate crisis in the way that the countries of the global north have. Our cumulative emissions in the global north have caused this problem, and yet we're going to let the people in the global south and the island nations suffer for a problem we cause. It's outrageous.
And in fact, the talk today, the theme of today's talks on this final day is in fact loss and damage. Can you tell us a bit about that agenda?
This is something that's new in this COP, which hasn't been discussed before, and it is one of the points of optimism and hope in that the nations of the global north have to some extent acknowledged that this is a problem that we have caused, that our cumulative damage to the planet is our responsibility, and that our prosperity has been based on it. So built into the COP is this concept of loss and damage, where the nations, the rich nations of the global north, will compensate our global neighbors for the damage that we've caused and help them overcome it. So what I'm worried about is that this will be watered down even further. But I am glad that it's in there because it hasn't even been discussed at previous COPs.
Another theme which today's second draft stresses is about finance. Now, there are two sides to that. First of all, we've heard a lot about the 100 billion that was promised already in 2009 that's not delivered yet. So do we see let me ask you about that first. Do you see any tighter mechanism towards actually handing over the money that the rich nations have already promised?
I think there's a lot of problems around finance, as you outline, whether the amount of money that has been promised will be given, how it will be given, whether it will be given in the right places, whether it will actually have the impact it's supposed to have. So it's one of those areas that I have great concerns about. But the global north have to live up to their commitments. Our prosperity and way of life has been based on fossil fuels, which we have to use that word, and I hope the final draft will have those words in it. Fossil fuels, coal, oil, and gas. These are what are causing the emissions that are damaging our biosphere. And we have to acknowledge our part in that and contribute some of the wealth that we've built on this to reparations, to making good the damage that we've caused.
On the subject of the money that we have pledged, which is still not delivered, so you're saying, first of all, you don't see any mechanism. So although everyone has said that should be delivered by 2023 or 25, I've read, but you don't see any concrete mechanism which is going to make that actually happen this time.
I'm not an expert in global finance, I will confess, so I don't know that much about the detail, the technical detail of the mechanisms, but what I hear is criticism on how it will be spent, whether you hand the money to governments, whether you hand the money to NGOs, whether it's given to people or projects. How do you make sure, even if we get the money, which would be great, how do you make sure it goes to those causes that will really make a difference and not just end up in the pockets of politicians elsewhere?
Yes, the other thing, let's talk closer to home then. Obviously the UK itself is committed to part of that 100 billion. Now the Scottish Government, of course, is not a signatory, but is there any pressure we can bear, or have you heard of any moves from the UK Government to at least contribute the UK's part of that 100 billion?
It's fair to say that I'm very disappointed with the UK's whole approach to COP. One of the reasons the Paris Agreement was such a success is because the French government spent the weeks in the run-up to Paris doing the hard work, doing the diplomacy to make the deal work. The UK did none of that. That's a major criticism of the UK's approach. Boris Johnson isn't even here today. We haven't seen the leadership. He's dodging his responsibility, and the UK government is not providing the leadership that we would hope. I think Scotland has done better. Certainly, I think Scotland is pushing the UK. It's something that we talk about a lot in government, is how we can push the UK, how we can have that conversation to try and bring the UK around to being the climate leader that we should be.
The second issue on finance, which is stressed a great deal, if you look at the second draft today, they talk a great deal about incentivising private finance, and they talk about the large financial institutions working across the world, and they're urging them to switch away from polluting technologies and to switch towards new technologies. Again, Scotland doesn't have any control over finance, but Scotland does have a huge financial sector. But do you see that the financial sector has any role in moving away from polluting technologies and actually putting investment into the emerging green technologies?
The financial industry absolutely has a leading role to play. They can do this. They could choose to take the lead. We see this all over the place where we see campaigns for divestment. So various pension funds and stuff saying, we no longer want to invest in fossil fuels. We're going to invest in other industries, in clean industries. So there is a global movement to put pressure on financial institutions to stop giving money and lending money to those businesses and industries that are destroying the planet. That's something we can keep up the pressure on, trying to keep the finance to supporting long-term sustainable industry.
Now, okay, let's return to I suppose the big issue really is fossil fuels. So looking at the second draft agreement, I can see one sentence which mentions fossil fuels, and I think the word fossil only appears once. That's the big issue, but it's been minimised. So should we really be saying that this COP is not going to be a success unless there's a commitment to end fossil fuel investment?
What is really shocking is how the words fossil fuels have never appeared in a COP document until now. And this shows you the power and the money in the fossil fuel industry. It is fossil fuels that are causing the climate crisis, and yet until this COP they were never even mentioned. And as you say, in this one they are only mentioned once. It's sort of the elephant in the room. We know they're what's causing the problem, but the lobbyists, I mean, fossil fuel company execs make millions of dollars every year as in their salaries. They are incentivized to keep going. Fossil fuel industries knew about climate, knew they were affecting the climate 30 years ago. And they have spent that 30 years lobbying relentlessly for subsidy, for tax breaks. And this is what they continue to do. They are so powerful. So absolutely, I am very disappointed that more governments haven't stood up to the fossil fuel interests and said, look, we have other sources of energy, we have other technologies available to us, let's go and develop those. They're letting the fossil fuel companies write the story, and that's extremely disappointing.
Now, you mentioned earlier on, Lorna, and today's loss and damage agenda as part of that, of course there are frontline states, if you like, the poorer countries, and the coastal states are the first. But one of the coastal states said last week, in fact right at the start of COP, one of the spokespersons from the island nations said, okay, we are in the front line, but if you don't defend your front line, everybody else is in danger too. So yes, the rich countries are slow to change, but we are also involved in this. We are also going to be affected, maybe not as quickly as some countries, but it's in our own survival interests to move on to renewables, isn't it? So why is a rich North not actually looking after its own interests and moving heavily into renewables? Isn't it in our own self-interest to do that too?
You're exactly right. It's crazy to think that any of us can escape the damage that, for example, a 3 degrees warming would cause. There's a huge arrogance of the sort of rich, you imagine the sort of rich white capitalist who thinks that their money can protect them from this. 3 degrees of global warming is catastrophic. It is food and water shortages worldwide. It is massive extinction events. It is half of Glasgow underwater. Like, this is our cities inundated. An enormous worldwide refugee crisis. This is not a future that we want. We haven't chosen 1.5 degrees as the goal because 1.5 degrees is safe. It's not safe. We're not even there yet, and we've already seen catastrophic floods in Germany. We see landslips in Scotland destroying roads that caused a train wreck last year that killed people. This isn't something that's just happening in the global south or the island nations. It's happening here too, the kind of flooding and things, the damage we see here. It's already happening here. So this is happening to us. It is costing us millions. It is costing us lives. And it is crazy that governments are turning a blind eye and pretending that we can keep on with business as usual. We cannot keep on with business as usual.
It's beginning to look now that, as this is the final day of COP, that this is not going to go down in history as the turning point. This does not look like the time when, as Prime Minister Johnson said last week, that this is the chance for society to go on a new path. I forget what his exact words were, but he says, we have this great opportunity. It's not going to happen, is it?
I think there's more than one way to look at this. COP is the conference of the parties, so that's those countries that are part of the UN. Scotland isn't one of those. There are cities and states and provinces all over the world who are not part of COP. We don't have to let COP be the limit of our ambition. We don't have to wait for Joe Biden and Boris Johnson to get their act together. We can do better, and we can do better every day in our communities. We can build cycle lanes, we can plant trees, we can clean up our green spaces so they're safe for kids to play in. We can make different choices about how we invest in transportation, and that's what I want to see us do here. To some extent, what happens at COP stays at COP, and what we have to do here doesn't change. We still have to take a lead in reducing our emissions and improving our landscapes and spaces.
Yes, obviously, as you said, the big story, the elephant in the room, if you like, is coal, oil and gas. Now, the Scottish Government doesn't have any serious say in those. However, the Scottish Government has been very active at this COP. As you say, there are other issues. The Scottish Government has been networking. We reported the other day on the biodiversity agreement, which the Scottish Government has taken a lead on, and the state of California signed up to that the other day. So from what you've seen, has the Scottish Government been working through those other channels, through its para-diplomacy, if you like, to make networks and to drive things forward?
That's exactly what we've been doing in the Scottish Government. So we've been working on real-life diplomacy. I've been meeting with ministers from other governments, from European governments, to talk about exactly these issues: biodiversity, how we improve agriculture, how we make sure we have regenerative agriculture, how we engage people who use the land, farmers, crofters, how we protect species. That's exactly the kind of on-the-ground diplomacy that COP has allowed us to do. Now, part of that, of course, is having Scotland recognised on the world stage as part of our plan to make Scotland an independent country, and part of it is about what we call the non-state actors, like California, like Scotland, like some of the big cities of the world, who are not parties to COP, but who really want to see more action on the climate crisis. And so we've been working together on those levels to build those relationships and commitments. As I say, COP is not the beginning and end of the story. We can still do so much more.
Yep, the story does not end here. So Lorna, Slater, Scottish Green Party and the Scottish Government, thank you for talking to Broadcasting Scotland this morning. A pleasure to meet you.
Thank you so much.
Hello, I'm joined this afternoon by Tom McLenachan, who represents a water NGO, Aqua. So hello Tom, thanks for coming up to the studio to join us this afternoon. Now Tom is attending COP26 and he's going to tell us a few minutes a bit more about the organisation he works with. So first of all, Tom, you've been up at already at COP26 and you have more meetings tomorrow, haven't you? In general, are you getting a good feeling about the outcomes that we can expect tomorrow?
I am, yes. Well, firstly, thank you, Hugh, to Broadcasting Scotland for inviting me. It's really exciting to be in Glasgow and speak about these issues on these kind of platforms. I think it's really important to have these kind of conversations. And I think these are probably the more interesting conversations, or the areas in which the real policy change comes in these type of meetings. I think my general impression overall has been quite positive. Especially sort of with the news breaking yesterday that the US and China have agreed a new pact between them to, recognizing that they're such big contributors to climate change, that they have to be the driving force among others. And I think the general level of participation has been extremely strong, albeit I think the representation from smaller countries or minority groups could have been a little bit stronger, not least from groups in countries such as Uganda, which is where my charity works.
Yes, we'll focus more on that in a few minutes, but since we're at a United Nations conference in Glasgow, I thought we could begin by looking at the role water security or water inequality has played in United Nations sustainable development. I remember back in the 1992 Rio Summit, the World Summit, it was called at that time. That's certainly one of the occasions where we decided as a planet that water security is a serious issue. And looking at your website for Aqua, we learned that something like 2 billion people don't have access to either clean, safe, fresh water or to sanitation. So that's it's an enormous problem, isn't it? And it's a problem holding back development.
You're absolutely right. It sits at the root of a lot of the fundamental problems that a lot of societies around the world are facing, prohibiting their development in other areas. So the other sustainable development goals around health and education and gender rights and climate change. And the work that we do as a charity focuses on Sustainable Development Goal 6, clean water and sanitation. But in reality, this issue, because it's at the core, straddles a lot of these other areas. To give a specific example from the context of Uganda, the average household spends 2 hours per day collecting water. More often than not, it's women and girls who carry this burden, literally carry this burden. And this is time that could be spent or should be spent in school or in professional development or just playing in the context of children. So we really want to tackle this core issue, recognizing that it sort of bleeds into other areas of development, as you say.
Yes, we will be stressing that on other programmes on Broadcasting Scotland, Tom, the idea that those who cause the climate crisis are not the same people who end up, as you say, literally carrying the burden for it. So that's a theme that has come up, and we will be discussing that again after COP has finished, when we're going to be looking back on some of the issues. And certainly gender issues are one of the areas that we want to, on Broadcasting Scotland, we want to come back to again. There is some progress, though, although, as I said before, there are still literally billions of people who don't have adequate, safe, fresh water. I noticed that the UN also says, of course, that water is a human rights issue. It's not a commodity, it's not a product, it's not a brand. Water is life, and we have a right to life. That's the centre point of human rights legislation, isn't it? The right to life. You can't have that without water. But they define, I noticed, the UN defines water security as access to between 50 and 100 litres a day of fresh water. I've no idea how much water I go through a day. I'm sure I manage that, 100, no problem. Have you any idea if any progress has been made since 1992? Are people getting more access to water than they had then?
Broadly speaking, on a global scale, there are positive trends, and you can see those also in the context of Uganda. But, you know, we sat here as people with sort of drinking water easily accessible right in front of us. We don't even think about the difficulty of getting it or think about the cleanliness of that water in most instances. Even the water might not be readily accessible, but often the security issues around collecting the water itself, you know, it's far away from locations. You have to access it from, for example, streams that include other different types of pollutants, agricultural waste seeping within there. So that raises a huge number of health issues. But it's varied between region, and the impacts of climate change is exacerbating that regularity or predictability of rainfall and general climate patterns, which means that although the overall trend is positive, you have extremes of drought and of flooding, which can greatly prohibit access to water in a lot of instances. So it still causes huge challenges.
Yes, indeed. Many spokespersons on the UN websites talk about the centrality of water and linking it to climate change. In fact, one video I was watching on the UN site says that, well, water, we've either got too much of it or we've not got enough of it. Water is at the centre of most of the damage. It's inundations, storms, and of course, ocean rising, which is an issue we've been talking about a lot in Glasgow. A lot of the nations who are threatened by having too much water have been here making their case and saying that it's got to be a 1.5, no more, or our country disappears. So it's the most ironic issue, I think, about sustainable development is that some people have got too much water, some people have not enough. In fact, as a very rough, I think this might be correct to say, but a very sweeping generalisation, the effect for Scotland anyway of climate change is that we have plenty of water and we're going to get more of it. So places with more rainfall are going to get more of it. Places with less rainfall are going to get less of it. That's a very broad sweeping statement, but that seems to be the way it is, isn't it?
That's absolutely right, and it's quite scary, really, when you look at those predictions that map out, for example, coastal flooding that will occur due to sea level rise, that obviously increases from 1.5 degrees and dramatically increases to 2 degrees and higher, where whole regions of Scotland and going down to England, particularly around the east coast, are expected to corrode due to sea level rise. But, you know, undoubtedly, it's part of the southern hemisphere, the so-called global south, that is going to face the brunt of the main climate impacts, you know, despite, as you say, contributing relatively little. I think as a whole, a historic contribution to climate change from Africa in terms of emissions is about 1 or 2%. It's extremely small. And the average person in Scotland, for example, will have the same, on average, individual carbon impact as 50 people in a Ugandan village.
Yes, again, the issue of climate justice has been has been prominent in not only in COP but in the talks we've had here at Broadcasting Scotland and with some of our guests. But let's look at the optimistic side. The UN had the water decade from 2005 up to 2015, and according to the UN, they have helped 1.3 billions gain access to safe drinking water. So they have made some progress there. And also looking up the strategy, since then, I think there have been 2 annual water days held every year. They have one on the 22nd of March, and the other one, interestingly enough, is coming up next week. Now, the slightly oddly named World Toilet Day is the 19th of November. Now, I must get toilet jokes out of the way. In British humour, that's sort of regarded as a kind of a silly thing, talking about toilets. Toilets is not a laughing matter, it's extremely important. November 19th, the United Nations wants to draw attention to the fact that half of the human race doesn't have adequate access to toilets and to clearing the muck away. Big issue.
Exactly. And I'm glad that you sort of made the segue towards looking at sanitation and hygiene as well in combination with water, obviously inherently interlinked issues, which all the more prominent due to sort of the impacts of COVID-19 as well. In the context of the region that we work in eastern Uganda, the access to good quality sanitation facilities and services is extremely poor, and that sits right at the base of a lot of other health issues, as you can imagine. So in the region that we work in, approximately 35% of the households have no adequate toilet facilities at all. So their only option is effectively open defecation outside their homes. And the health impacts are insanely high due to that. So the survival rate of Ugandan children up to 5 years old is extremely worrying, and a lot of that is from such simple things such as diarrhea, and that has a huge impact on child mortality. And right at the root cause of that is water, sanitation, and hygiene.
Yes, as you say, these topics are linked. The sanitation is linked to health, it's linked to child mortality. Yeah, I believe it's something like 5 in 100 children will not live to the fifth birthday. And yes, most of that is because of sanitation. But at the same time, I introduced this topic from the point of view of sustainable development. And of course, if we emphasize the development side of it, of course, we want Uganda to be able to increase its economy. There is a general, as with many African countries, there's a general drift away from agriculture towards industry, isn't there? So, but that's very slow. But there is a general movement away towards higher production and therefore higher productivity and hopefully higher wage jobs. But again, I read from the research on the UN, that's all being held back by health and education problems. So they all come wrapped up together again. People need to move into higher productive jobs with wages, but to do that, they need education. But how are they going to get education if the family is ill and they have to spend 2 hours a day fetching water? So you can't really get development unless you really tackle this water question. It's right at the core, isn't it?
You're precisely right. And that's why we focus a lot of our activities around sort of skills development and entrepreneurial style training to empower people to be able to create businesses that support themselves or their communities. The answer in development, very generally speaking, more often than not is sort of that short-term intervention of sort of new infrastructure that is not adequately maintained over time. It's giving people the fundamental skills and understanding and empowering them to be able to drive their own independent internally, as it is much is from someone like me from the UK as dictating what the solution should be.
Yeah, empowerment. Again, that's a phrase that comes up a great deal. And maybe we could discuss later on the idea of a World Bank or Western-style intervention, moving in with big projects, moving in big money. And is it more about getting small-scale local projects and getting power and influence and money to people who need it? So maybe we can look at that later on. Before we come on to that, again, on economic development in Uganda is connected to this. Have you any up-to-date information? The whole country had to basically shut down for 4 months because of COVID. So all this takes place in that context as well. Africa's been as much affected as anyone else. I believe economic growth is just beginning to return now. But again, COVID just comes on top of all this. So has it been a double blow to places like Uganda?
Yeah, it has indeed. Unemployment has soared, education opportunities have been curtailed. Schools in Uganda are still closed as we speak, despite the overall number of cases, for example, being lower than they are here in the UK. But the vaccine rollout is considerably lower. And, again, one of the impacts of schools being closed is increased teenage pregnancy as well, with kids being out of school. So, again, we need to focus on providing alternative skills or alternative education to women and girls who find themselves in those kind of situations. And, at the same time, personal costs that people have greatly increased. So, for example, transportation costs have tripled because your average bus or public transportation service is only able to take a third as much capacity, and then those after effects fall on people. So, yeah, the economic impacts have compounded all of those issues that we've discussed.
Yeah. Well, let me turn now, before we move on to the other general issues about, I'm interested in how you got involved. I see on the website you met, it's Abel Odeke and yourself. Was it really the two of you who started Aqua, and where did you meet?
Yeah, so I was lucky enough to volunteer in Uganda 2 years ago on a UK government-sponsored programme called the International Citizen Service Programme. It effectively pairs up young volunteers from the UK who are sent to a developing country. They assemble a team of young volunteers from that country and they work together on a particular issue. So Abel and I met exactly in that context, volunteering together in a small rural community in Uganda. And it was in that community that both of us observed firsthand the real challenges that people face in access to water, sanitation and hygiene. And that really inspired us to take this work forward and create our own organisation that did this. And although it was originally our ideas, we were swiftly joined by another group of people who volunteered on that or similar programs. So, we consider ourselves a group of co-founders collectively, and we've since expanded to over 20, 30 people spread across the world. So it's really accelerated quite quickly.
Yes, I see. Is it based in London or in Kampala?
Both. So we are constitutionally and legally registered as two separate organisations, but in reality we operate on equal terms. The key distinction is that the Ugandan team come up with the policies and the programmes and the projects. Again, who am I to say to dictate from England what their solution should be? And from the English side, we see our role as being more of allowing that or enabling that to happen through fundraising, through communications, through raising awareness about the topic. But really, it's a collaborative venture, an international one as well. So we have representatives throughout the UK, in Uganda, Trinidad and Tobago, and Belgium itself. So it really is an international movement.
Right, so that's how you got started. If people want to learn more about Aqua, your website is ecolaqua.org. It's easy enough to find, and it really is an excellent website. I'd recommend have a look at that and see more about what Aqua are doing. So congratulations on that website. That's very easy to use, and we can see what you're on about there. So that's how you got started. I want to return to the question of development. It strikes me when a country is developing and wanting to move into industry for reasons we gave earlier on, it strikes me that could put even more pressure on the water system. One of the sustainable issues that we come across is, for example, the impact of tourism in many as a country. I don't know if this has been seen in Uganda. In many countries we find that, say, a big project, a big hotel leisure complex is sited somewhere, and everyone says, great, that'll bring jobs, that'll bring in millions of investment, but it ends up being disastrous for people locally. And apart from anything else, it must suck a lot of water, because Westerners, we need a lot of water. Yeah. So is there a clash there? Is there a competition for scarce resources?
It is definitely a challenge, and one that you need to think about quite carefully. There's been a lot of instances, for example, in the news in the last couple of years of celebrities from the UK going to Uganda and trying to lead on development projects or presenting themselves as doing so without having a good, strong understanding of some of those fundamental issues that we've discussed. A lot of what goes to the core of a lot of the projects, or how we deliver a lot of our projects, is that we try and source all materials and all labour from within Uganda, so that all of our investment from the UK, from our various donors who support our projects, goes directly or stays within the Ugandan labour force or the Ugandan economy. So we procure ceramic water filters that are built in Ugandan factories with Ugandan workers. We work with an organisation called the Ichupa Upcycle Project to build water tanks with a model that was designed in sort of a collaboration between Uganda and the United States, and again using local workers to be able to build those. So it's about being conscious of those cycles. and be able to support the local economy while also furthering development.
Yep. So you don't necessarily see industrial or tourism development as being an enemy, but it is possible to work in partnership if it's properly planned. Now, something I'm completely ignorant about is the actual sources of water in Uganda. Well, obviously, just looking at a map, I can see you've got Lake Victoria. That must have plenty. But where does the water come from? Where do these people have to go to get it? Is it streams flowing out of mountains? I mean, basically, is there enough there if you had the infrastructure to pipe it to where it's needed?
It's a really good question. So it's varied sort of by household and across regions of the country, and varied throughout the year as well. So the primary source of water often changes during that time. So it's a combination of things. It's a combination of boreholes, bringing up water from underground, sourcing directly from rivers. As I mentioned before, more often than not, the quality of water from those sources is extremely poor. In urban areas, you do have instances of piped water, but again, the quality is not sufficient that you can safely say it's drinkable water. And the fourth option, the one that we prioritise, is harvesting rainwater. So a free and readily accessible source of water if that local infrastructure, i.e. the ability of a tank or roof to capture the water to put it in there is precisely on location of a school or household, is much better in all instances, while not in itself being perfect. You also need to treat that water adequately. But a lot of it comes down to investment. So national or international investment in putting that infrastructure in the ground. But in the context of Uganda, massively geographically dispersed country facing a lot of political challenges in most recent years, those solutions aren't as easy as what you might think.
Now, talking about storage of rainwater, I noticed there's a fascinating project on your website making a water tank out of recycled plastic. That seems to be a kind of a comment. We'll use we'll use these bottles for something different. What do you call them? That's your eco-brick tanks.
Eco-bricks, yeah. So we're partners with another local organisation in Uganda called the Achupa Upcycle Project. And they've pioneered this design for a rainwater harvesting tank made from eco-bricks. Eco-bricks are recycled or upcycled plastic bottles, average drink bottles that tend to be discarded. You fill these bottles with more plastic or sand, and it makes them harder, in fact, and cheaper than your average brick. And you can create the walls of the water tank with a bit of waterproof concrete using these bricks, and it's quite a sturdy source for the tank. You can go up to 10,000 litres. And one of the main benefits of this approach, and why we're so keen to partner with the Achupa Upcycle project, is because it's solving two problems at once. It's solving the issue of access to water, but also the issue of plastic pollution. So in the context of Uganda, only 5% of plastic is recycled. There is no, national recycling scheme. There is no meaningful, in rural areas, garbage or waste disposal at all. Plastic, in more often than not, is burnt, which causes huge sort of localized environmental issues in itself, or it tends to be discarded in a way that blocks waterways. Again, all of these issues overlap in lots of ways. So, by constructing these tanks, it's using these bottles that were otherwise burned, but also it sends a message. It's really sort of symbolic, because we tend to partner with this organisation to build the tanks at schools. The students of these schools are able to look at these tanks and see that actually, there is another application for these discarded plastic bottles. Or, in a sense, they tell a story about waste and recycling and climate change and water maintenance. And that's why, we integrate this infrastructure, these tanks, with lessons and workshops and seminars around telling this wider narrative to upskill people.
Excellent. It strikes me as a great example of what we used to call intermediate technology. In other words, I was going to go back to that question of if the World Bank adopts a country and prescribes what you have to do and sends billions of dollars into big schemes. Maybe it's build a new airport or something like that, or maybe a new shopping mall. Yeah. But the other approach is, let's just say, what does this particular community here need, and what can we do to put them in charge of it? Is there a kind of a distinction between, the kind of the big, the huge approach at central government level and a more local approach? Are there two different ways of looking at these problems?
I think you need a combination of both, realistically. There's advantages and disadvantages to both models. A charity of our size, which operates on an extremely small budget and works in a very concentrated geographic area, brings a lot of great advantages in that we don't have a lot of administrative costs. So we have literally zero cost spent in the UK. All the money that we raise is sent to Uganda. And in Uganda, much like Broadcasting Scotland, by the way, is a team comprised entirely of volunteers who do it for the passion around the cause, tackling water inequality. So that means we don't have very little or almost zero fixed costs. So it's more economical use of money in that kind of way. However, we don't have the economies of scale as what the investments of groups such as the World Bank or larger organisations looking at similar issues like Water Aid are able to implement. But both need to work in harmony and deliver projects in combination, I think.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so it's not either or, again, it's partnership. On that topic, how well do you get on with local government officials? Are they generally supportive of your efforts? And are there any political issues, any different political parties you have to try and steer around?
They are hugely supportive, actually, and I think our work would be impossible without them, or certainly not possible at the kind of quality, in the sense that they are really invaluable in helping us to access those groups within the region facing the greatest inequalities in access to water, sanitation and hygiene. So that's inequalities of gender, of age, of income, of ethnic background, refugee status, all those kind of things. Without their help, I think we would struggle to find and gain access and gain trust with those groups. And more often than not, local governments are more than happy to come and represent at our workshops, or engage with us in opening ceremonies for our water tanks, for example. I think engaging on a larger national scale does pose more problems in more instances than not, because there isn't the necessary budget available to be able to do that, and there is some trepidations around sort of the impact or the motivations of international organisations, or in our case, part international organisations, to come and, as I say, dictate the solution. But overall, I think very, very positive relationship.
So obviously there's a huge amount to be done. As we've said before, we shouldn't forget that a quarter of humanity doesn't have access to water, which is a right. But you can see signs of progress being made. Is that reflected in COP26? Have you seen, I've not been in, were there any particular stalls or initiatives or organisations talking about the centrality of water in sustainable development?
I'm going to the Green Zone for the first time tomorrow, so I'm looking forward to find out more. I'm not aware of a specific pact that's been announced in relating to water, sanitation, hygiene, but it, as we say, it all overlaps. And I think the decree, for example, to curtail deforestation by 2030 is vitally important and an overlapping issue. Trees can not only encourage sort of localized rainfall, suck carbon out of the atmosphere, have a stronger footing on the ground to prevent landslides, and also improve the water cycle within itself. So I'll be interested to see, for example, how that policy plays out in the context of Uganda. And we also do a little bit as a side project, some tree planting as well, within the context of the schools to support that issue directly.
Yeah, to support water retention and soil. Yeah, there was an announcement yesterday from the Scottish Government about how important soil is. Soil actually is a huge carbon store. If you look after it, if you don't let the soil turn to dust and blow away. So again, trees keep soil together, soil keeps the water there. Just finally, before we move on, I believe you came up on the hydrogen train, is that right?
I participated in an event on Tuesday wearing my other hat, which is a civil servant working in transport decarbonisation, in an event on a hydrogen train. That's right. So Network Rail have been testing and experimenting with the UK's first hydrogen-powered train. Hydrogen being seen one of the potential solutions for rail decarbonisation, particularly useful, on distant rural lines that it's sort of expensive and perhaps impractical to electrify the whole line. So it's to enable trains to go that extra journey. And it's, hydrogen fuel is a clear option available, and perhaps one of the only options for air travel and for freight as well.
Yes, we're talking a lot about that these days. Both the UK government and the Scottish government have a strategy for hydrogen, and it seems to be getting rolled out over 2030. We will be covering that in other programmes, Tom, so I was wondering what your thoughts were on that. But the reason I raised it now is about the whole question of new technology and sustainable development. Now, in what way does new technology impact on a place like Uganda? Can they skip the coal mining phase and go straight to solar power? Is there capacity for that, and is it not yet being fully exploited?
It's challenging. You know, the reason why there is so much coal around is it's an extremely cheap source of fuel. It's very difficult to be able to dictate to a developing country that you can't enjoy all the benefits of the cheap energy that we've been benefiting from ourselves over several decades. So we need to empower people to adopt cleaner sources of energy, such as solar, more quickly. You know, I think it takes a long time in that context to be able to make those kind of changes, but really we're out of time in a sense. The technology is there, and you know, technologies such as solar, for example, are sufficiently cheap to be able to prioritize them in a lot of contexts, not least in Uganda, where that particular technology pays greater fruit from greater amounts of sunlight throughout the year than it would do in Scotland, for example. So, you know, I really hope that there is more, we can gain greater confidence from COP26 that we will see the investment that has been promised in the Paris Agreement, or, you know, an investment that goes further than that 100 billion to be able to support that transition.
Yep, so it's a transition towards a sustainable economy and to a fair and a just world economy. So we hope we have seen some steps towards that at COP26 here in Glasgow. Tom, so thanks for coming along. So that was Tom McLenachan from Aqua. And please have a look at the website if you want to see more about what the NGO and Tom and his colleagues are doing there. So thank you on behalf of Broadcasting Scotland. Tom, it's been a pleasure to have you in the studio. Thank you for coming along. And I hope you enjoy the other sessions you're going to at the Green Room.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
What distinguishes Broadcasting Scotland from a website or blog, apart from our brilliant programmes?
Hi there, I'm Gordon Ross.
Are the costs we face to enable us to produce those programmes. These costs are significant and ongoing. However, our facilities are able to do so much more if only we had the staff. In the last year, some of our supporters have cancelled their subscriptions. In one way, we would prefer it if it was because they didn't like us, rather than it being because of the financial pressures which we are all under because of COVID. The really positive outcome of our fundraiser is that at a time of economic challenge in Scotland, we will use your donations to create jobs and in a small way contribute to improving the Scottish economy. If you want us to be Scotland's independent broadcaster, able to provide an alternative mainstream television platform, then please support us.
Scotland is going to be an independent country.
Just imagine what we could do if we had even 1% of the BBC Scotland channel's budget. Imagine. And then please consider turning your imagination into reality. Please support us if you can afford it.